If you're looking to make your training more engaging and successful, it's hard to find a more effective way to get there than with well-built, relevant gamification. But a lot of e-learning designers try gamification and they don't see the results they want, or it takes them too much time and money. And when that happens, it's usually because they're making one of the mistakes that I'm about to show you. As someone who's been doing this for over 10 years and helped hundreds do the same, I can tell you that there's a lot of shiny objects out there mimicking as good gamification, and it's easy to fall into one of those traps and destroy your hard work. So here are my top 5 costly mistakes people make when they're looking to gamify their training. The most effective e-learning is organized around your measurable, observable learning objectives. Using those as a starting point, you build activities for the learner to engage in, and then you can add incentives, and then you worry about polish. Generally speaking, the farther out you get from these core activities, the less impact you're having on real-world results and learner engagement. Now, if you have the time to build the whole package, great, but if you don't, that's okay. The cognitive mechanics are enough to engage your learner and move the needle in the real world. It's happened several times in my program that people developed gamified programs with only cognitive mechanics, and yet clients go nuts and they get hired to do more without ever using a single reward. So number 1 on the list is prioritizing rewards above all else. In other words, only using this layer, the motivational mechanics. This is the kind of gamification you see everywhere. You take traditional e-learning, teach, test, teach, test, teach, test, and you just add rewards to it without changing the core activity. So you don't change how you impart information or how you assess, that stays the same. You just tack rewards onto it. And of course, these rewards in and of themselves don't make the information easier to understand, so the only way they can improve the learning outcome is if they really motivate people to pay more attention and persevere more. And maybe that'll happen if your audience is really starved for stimulation, but usually the best you can hope for is that they'll be pleasantly surprised to see the first reward, but that's only because of the novelty. As they keep going, they're going to quickly habituate to that, and so the rewards can't really maintain the engagement once that novelty wears off. If my training sucked before, it will still suck with rewards tacked onto it. Plus, in some cases, this can make learners actually feel patronized, like you're dangling a badge in front of them and going, "Who's a good boy?" This is so common that I wish people would stop calling it gamification, but I guess bad dancing is still dancing, so bad gamification is still gamification. The next mistake is putting the tool first. If you want to gamify e-learning in a way that yields results, your tool does need to allow you to do a couple basic things. It needs to let you give the learner some meaningful choices or things to do, and have meaningful things happen as a result of those learner actions. That means it's hard to gamify things with tools like Rise or Genially, but Storyline and Captivate give you everything you need. And although some tools allow you to do more than that, you don't need it. But a lot of designers get focused on a specific technology and they feel they absolutely need to use it. And instead of really using the learning objective as their source of inspiration, they'll try to shoehorn that learning objective into that tool, whether it makes sense to or not. One example of this is virtual reality. VR allows you to move around a virtual environment and manipulate objects in 3D space. And for some learning objectives, that can be highly relevant and bring added value to the training. If you're teaching someone how to inspect a motor, then yeah, maybe VR would make sense here. I've used VR for surgery simulations, which again is a task where you're manipulating things in 3D space, so VR can be helpful there. But it doesn't really add value if you're teaching Spanish or if you want people to learn the multiplication tables. I absolutely have seen things like this where learners will actually read walls of text and click next in a virtual world. That is not gamified. And when we do that, we're increasing the user's cognitive load to learn a new interface, and of course it's probably going to increase the time and budget without returning much in terms of learning outcomes. So remember to let your learning objectives determine if the added tech is really relevant. Next, remember when Nintendo first put out the Wii? I remember looking at Wii Tennis and laughing at the graphics with a couple of colleagues. We were like, wow, this took one guy one afternoon to make. They really didn't spend much on the graphics. But of course, the Wii turned out to be a massive success and it outsold the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 because what mattered was how intuitive it was. Everyone knows how to swing a stick, and when you're immersed in an engaging activity, you kind of stop seeing the graphics anyway and you'll focus just on your goals in that environment. And the reverse is also true. If your program or your game is super dull or really tedious and getting through it is like chewing rocks, then great graphics will not save it. So putting graphics first is our next mistake, and that one comes in two flavors. First, People often overestimate how important graphical polish is to learner engagement. And because graphics are often the part of production that's going to cost you the most, and they can take a lot of time, a lot of your bandwidth and budget can get sucked into that when you don't actually need it to engage people. The second form of that mistake is to worry about the graphics too early in the production. If you put a lot of effort into your graphics early in the process, I promise it's going to take you longer to make your program overall, and you're going to multiply your number of headaches all the way through development. You're much better off prototyping quick and dirty and really polishing at the end. This next one is a bit weird for me because when I worked in games, gameplay first was one of the tenets that we lived by. But when you're making a serious game with a learning objective, gameplay has to take a back seat to that learning goal. So in gamified training, gameplay first is actually a mistake. This happens when people go to DevLearn or some ID conference and they see a training game and they fall in love with it, and they decide that the next time they make a course, they're going to use that game and they're going to try to squeeze their content into it. I've covered this in another video, but if you've got your content in a container that's not made for it, that can actually make it harder to understand, not easier. In some of the worst case scenarios, I've seen programs where you're playing a game that's totally unrelated to the content and it's just there for fun, and then it stops and you have to complete some learning activity and then you can go back to the game. That's the very definition of a gimmick. Again, you want to use your learning objective and your learner's real-world context as the source of inspiration for your training game. That's when the game and the content can really work together to make everything clearer. And the final mistake is story first. I might get yelled at in the comments for this one. It happens because a lot of people put a lot of stock in storytelling, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes stories can be used as part of your cognitive mechanics, like in a branching scenario. In that case, the story helps you understand causes and effects. But often in e-learning, people will use stories just as a wrapper. You'll have the intro and then some relevant gameplay and then more story and more gameplay and so on and so forth. In a lot of those cases where the story is just there for fun and motivation, you could totally ignore it and the activities would still work. And if that's how you're using your story, then I wouldn't spend a lot of time and budget on it, and I definitely wouldn't start by building that. Get your learning activities to a place where they help the learner reach a learning objective, and then, if the time and the budget allows it, add your story. And I recommend making it skippable because in that case, the story is part of your presentational layer and it's not vital to making things understandable. So there you have it, 5 costly mistakes in e-learning and gamification. Let me know in the comments if I missed any other big ones. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.